Thank you, Alessandro, for the introduction, and more than anything else, thank you for inviting us. It's truly an honor for me, I think for us, including also Professor Cesaratto, to have the opportunity to discuss with a world that is a little bit distant from our usual interest of research. Hopefully, we'll make it interesting and understandable on both sides. So, I'm trying to do basically two things. I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. Please, if I'm not understandable, if I take for granted too many things, please interrupt me and let me know that I'm telling you something not understandable. So, what I'm going to do is trying to address the basic objectives. The first one, I would like to do the boring stuff, so to speak, the economist boring stuff. So I want to introduce, let's say, a toolbox and some basic concept to smooth the discussion. So I'm going to specifically discuss the balance of payments, what the balance of payments is, and why this is important. And then hopefully I will move to something slightly more interesting, and I will introduce at a very introductory and basic level the main trade theories in the history of economic thought, trying to compare and contrast alternative approaches to the economic problem, something you should be already more or less aware of before, because of previous rounds of the seminars, and specifically because of Antonella Palumbo's presentation. But first things first, let me start. I'm going to spend some time, as I told you, about boring stuff. So I'm confessing in advance. In doing that, what I'm going to do is explaining what is the balance of payments. Well, the balance of payments first is nothing more, nothing less than a set of accounts. Why am I going to bother you with the balance of payments? Well, because this is, in a sense, one way to explain why trade is important for an economy, and also in order to understand what are the constraints that the opening to trade causes to economies involved in trade. So basically, the balance of payments is nothing more, nothing less than a set of accounts keeping track of all the transactions of a country with the rest of the world. This is the basics. Still, it is not just an accounting document. It's a document with an inner dynamics. Understanding these dynamics allows us to unveil some important tendencies related to international trade. The balance of payments of each country basically has two main components, has two legs. The first one is the so-called current account. The current account basically keeps track of what a country sells to the rest of the world and to what a country buys from the rest of the world. This is called the trade balance. I'm going to mention the terminology, but this is not strictly necessary here. The other part of the current account are the so-called net incomes. The basic intuition is, if I'm going to, let's say, Germany for a 2 months consultancy, I receive a payment. This counts for Italy as an income coming to Italy. If, on the other hand, I don't know, the Italian government hires a German lawyer for a consultancy, it pays a fee of whatever. This is an income leaving Italy and going to Germany. What is important here is keeping track of the direction of the money. So if I'm selling goods abroad, these are my exports. I have an inflow of money coming my way. This is recorded with the sign plus. If myself, an Italian citizen, I go to a foreign country for a short-term job, I receive a payment, this is another inflow of money coming my way. So I record it with the sign plus. If, on the other hand, I buy, let's say, a mobile from Japan or wherever, this is for my country, for Italy, an import, an outflow of money leaving Italy and going from Germany. This is something I will record with a sign minus. I add all the items with a positive sign. I subtract all the items with a minus sign. What I get is the balance. This is what we call the current account balance. Why this is important? This is important for various reasons, but for what is relevant here, for one reason. Keep in mind that I'm not going to bother you with the equations. It's not necessary. I'll try to make good with the intuition. If my current account balance is positive, if I have a surplus in my current account balance, basically my country at the overall level, meaning my households, my firm, and my government are spending less than the aggregate income of the country. If, on the other hand, I record a negative current account balance, a deficit in my current account, my country, at the aggregate level, that is to say, my country's households, my country's firms, my government, well, at the aggregate level, they are spending more than the country's aggregate income. This is the basic thing I want you to keep in mind. Now, let's start from this second case, the case in which we have a negative current account, a deficit in the current account. How can country, or for what is worth, how can any subject spend more than his or her income? Well, basically, there are two ways in which this can be done. One is by resorting to debt, getting into debt. The other one is using some accumulated inventories, let's call them inventories of resources that you can use to cover for your extra expenditures. Keep in mind that this second part of the story is recorded in the second and final main leg of the balance of payments, what is called the financial account. The financial account is the other fundamental component of the balance of payments and basically records, let's say, the acquisition or selling of financial assets. That is to say, if my country, households, firm, or government are getting into debt with the rest of the world, or if on the other hand, they are lending to the rest of the world. This is one thing recorded in the financial account. The other thing recorded in the financial account is what happens to my official reserves. Because the other alternative to cover my eventual deficit in the current account is to resort to my accumulated reserves of foreign currencies. So I can use my reserves of foreign currencies to pay for my purchases of goods from abroad and all this kind of things. What is the bottom line? What is the important part of the story I'm trying to depict here? Well, the story is that by looking at the balance of payments, you have a grasp of the fact that trading with the rest of the world obviously offers a lot of opportunities of having access to goods you don't produce, exchange enriches all the parts involved in the trade, of course. Still, the openness to the international dimension also represent a constraint for an economy. This is what we call the balance of payment constraint. Let us try to make a very simple and perhaps too silly example. Let's assume that my country is running a current account which is perfectly balanced. So we are not getting into debt with the rest of the world. We are not lending anything to the rest of the world. Let's assume that our government decides to try to stimulate the economy, for example, by increasing its spending, by building new hospitals, by building new streets, hiring new professors, whatever. This is something that obviously has beneficial effect on my economy, because this is a boost to my economy, the aggregate income goes up and everybody will be better off. There is a but coming in my discourse. If I have higher income as a country, I will be purchasing more goods and more services, including more goods from abroad. So I will increase my imports, and this will contribute to worsen my current account. A worsening in my current account might imply that I'm going to either get into debt with the rest of the world, or I might need to resort to my accumulated reserves of foreign currencies to take care of my payments. Now, getting into debt is something that in the long run might become troublesome, because pays have to be either repaid or rolled over, but in any case, okay, sorry, okay, but in any case, you have to pay a debt or an interest over your debt. If you don't get into debt, you might need to use your official reserves, but your official reserves are of a finite amount. You can't use them forever. So this is a reminder that the openness to trade, the openness to the rest of the world also imposes a constraint to how much a country can grow. If you get into balance of payment problems, you can go to things. Either you try to slow down your economy, something that is obviously unpleasant because it means causing a worsening in the in the standard of living of households and furrows in my country, or you can try to increase the attractiveness of what you try to sell abroad. You try to increase the attractiveness of what you aim to export. Not something that is easily doable in 1, 2, or 3 weeks, but something that takes time. So the first message that it's useful to bring home is that the openness to international trade offers a lot of opportunities of enrichment from the economic, social, and cultural point of view. It still represents a potential source of troubles, or in any case, it represents a constraint on the performance that an economy can adopt. Sergio is going to elaborate a lot on that, so I'm leaving this part of my speech here, knowing that Sergio will take the baton and move forward with these suggestions. The other thing I want to do in my part of this intervention is trying to give you a glimpse into the main theories of international trade, the main economic theories of international trade. Let me be more precise and less. So, as you know from previous rounds of this beautiful series of seminar, there is not a single economic theory, right? In spite of what mainstream economists tend to believe and tend to teach in class, definitely more than one. There is definitely more than one economic of thought school. In particular, and I'm obviously cutting several corners and I'm oversimplifying the issue, you can identify a big divide between classical political economy and what is known under various labels, that is to say, marginalist or neoclassical or mainstream economic theories. I'm using marginalist, neoclassical, mainstream as synonyms. So this is the main divide we have to keep in mind. This is something useful because, as I will try to tell you, depending on the approach to economic theory you take, you get a different understanding of what causes various economic phenomena, and in particular, international trade, given what we are talking about today. Let me start, for chronological reasons, from the classical approach. With classical approach, what I'm referring to is the approach popularized by Adam Smith, David Riccardo, Karl Marx, and many others, and updated starting from the 60s of the 20th century by Piero Sraffa, Pierangelo Garignani, and many others. Something that, and this is something Professor Cesaratto will touch upon once again, has also been labeled as the surplus approach, given the centrality of the concept of surplus for this economic school. So, what are the explanations? What is the interpretation of international trade proposed by classical scholars? Well, let me first take a step aside and let me add something that I should not be adding here because I know that you know these things way better than me, but let me say it nonetheless. Let's try to understand where we are located. Adam Smith, the end of the 18th century, David Riccardo, the beginning of the 19th century. Okay, so we are in the, I'm not going to be very precise, but please forgive me, we are in the first stages of the Industrial Revolution. It's not random. It's not something happening by chance that the first systematic theories of international trade emerge in the first stage of the Industrial Revolution. Well, simply because due to the Industrial Revolution, I'm not being very precise, but the expert of antiquities are here to be more precise than me in this respect. So let's say there is something that can be object of trade in a systematic and not in a sporadic way, okay, due to the development of industry and a heavy manufacturing industry. But sorry for the detour. Adam Smith. Adam Smith proposes what we can think of as the first systematic analytic explanation of international trade, what is known as the theory of absolute advantages. I'm sorry. The theory of Adam Smith is apparently quite simple, but as I will try to argue, it has a deeper meaning and a not so easy to grasp message to be got. So, the theory of absolute advantages of Adam Smith fundamentally posits that every country will specialize. Thank you. Thank you. So each country will specialize in the production segment where it holds an absolute advantage. What does it mean? That we know, I think you know again better than me, the Adam Smith emphasis on the division of labor, right? The division of labor is with the related specialization process, according to Adam Smith, is something that has to happen at the firm level, but it's also something that has to happen at the international level, meaning that every country has to specialize in the production where it has an absolute advantage, that is to say, it has to specialize in the production where that country results as the most effective one. So the implicit message is that every country will find its niche of production. It will produce that goods that is able to produce in the most efficient, cost minimizing way, and will export of that goods the surplus, a surplus that is defined in a different way from the, let's say, internal surplus Professor Cesaratto perhaps will refer to, or that in any case the predecessors in this seminar have discussed.
Please, audience, mute yourself.
Apparently, everybody was mute, so I don't know what happened. Okay, sorry for my interruption. So, every country will export the surplus of its niche of production, meaning with surplus, what it exceeds, the part, the quantity of that goods that is consumed domestically, and will purchase from the rest of the world, will import from the rest of the world the respective surpluses. So let us assume this is a two-country world. Let's make it very simple. Country A and country B. Both countries will find a niche where to specialize. Each country will produce exclusively that and will buy from the other country the surplus of what that country produces, exceeding the needs of that country. So, as I was telling you, this is an apparently quite simple explanation of international trade. However, if we try to give second thought, is a particularly restrictive description of consumption because it implicitly assumes that in order to be trade, in order to be part of international trade, every country has to find a niche of production in which it is capable of producing in the most effective way, in the way that is most cost minimizing. Let me use a boring economic term. Okay? So let me underline something. The determinant of trade here is technology. Each country will specialize and will export what can produce in the most effective way when compared to the trade partners. On the other hand, this implies that the only way to have trade is that you, as a country, have to find a specific segment of production in which you do the best, and you will specialize in that production and export that and exchange it with the surpluses of the other country. A quite relevant and important step forward with respect to this theory comes from David Riccardo, another father of modern political economy and another classical political economist. David Riccardo is renowned for tons of contribution. In international trade, David Riccardo is renowned for his theory of comparative advantages. Let me try, before delving into the theory, into the bottom line. David Riccardo tells us a slightly different story from Adam Smith. In particular, Riccardo tells us that a country will be able to join international trade, to be part of international trade, even if that country has a disadvantage in all the segments of production. Let's make it very simple once again. There are two countries in the world. We have a two-country world. Let's assume that one country has an absolute advantage in both the production, let me take a step aside. Let's make it very simple. We have a two-worlds country with only two goods produced. Okay? Two countries, two goods produced. Riccardo tells us that there will be international trade between these two countries, even if one of the two countries holds an advantage in both production. So even if one country is the most effective one in both production, there will be a way to have specialization and following from specialization trade between the two countries. The fundamental message is that a country will specialize either in the production where it has the greatest advantage or in the production where it has the lowest disadvantage. Let's call it in this way. So the country with an absolute advantage in both production will specialize in only one of the two production, the one in which the advantage is greater. On the other hand, the country with the absolute disadvantage in both production will specialize itself where the disadvantage is relatively low. So, in a sense, we have a less restrictive depiction of the conditions under which trade can happen between two or many countries for what is worth if we want to generalize our example. There is a very, very important piece to add here, something that usually mainstream economists tend to forget at this part of the story. In order to have trade under this condition, is fundamental that we have international immobility of capitals. If there were mobility of capitals between countries, the entrepreneur finding herself in the country that has a disadvantage in both production will simply take her capital and move the capital and production to the other country in order to enjoy the absolute advantage in both production. If that were the case, there will be industrial desertification of one country and the other country producing everything, something that it's definitely not conducive to trade. So, Riccardo tells us that a prerequisite for trade under this condition is that we have immobility of capital, international immobilities of capital. You are an entrepreneur and you find yourself in the country with the disadvantage in both production, you need to stick in the country where you are and specialize in the production of the goods where the disadvantage is comparatively lower. So, differently from Riccardo, we have a different characterization of the conditions under which trade can happen. However, we still have the fundamental intuition that technology, from Smith, sorry, of course, I said Riccardo twice, yes, different from Smith, but the underlying mechanism is akin to that of Smith, a very important determinant of trade that justifies the need for trade is technology, the technologies of production. So the effectiveness in production drives specialization. Specialization is a driver of trade. Every country specializes in something and buys the rest of goods and services from another country. And this is what all the countries will do. And this is what will generate international trade. There will be many, many things to add, but my time is expiring. So let me move to the marginalist approach. But of course, if you have doubt, curiosities, we can discuss it. We can discuss it later on. Let me briefly move to the marginalist approach, okay? And then I'm going to leave the floor to Professor Cesaratto. So, Professoressa Antonella Palumbo gave you the basics, more than the basics of the distinction between marginalist and the classical approach. So, building on that, let me tell you something about the marginalist approach to international trade. Again, the marginalist approach to international trade comprises several contributions. Cutting corners once again, I would say that the most famous one is due to two Swedish economists of the 30s, Ekscher and Olin, who basically developed what today is known as the Ekscher-Olin theorem of international trade. Their view of international trade is, I would say, drastically different. Let me express Ekscher-Olin theorem as it is, and then I'll try to make an example, okay? Basically, the Ekscher-Olin theory posits that every country will specialize in the production of the goods whose production requires a relatively more intense use of the factor of production of which that country is relatively more endowed. This is the theorem. Now let me try to give some substance with a silly example, okay? Let's assume we have two countries, country A and country B, and we have two goods to be produced and traded. Okay, one good are bottles of water. The other goods are computers. Okay, let's assume that to produce computers you need relatively more capital goods and relatively less laborers, less workers. So computers are a more capital intensive production. On the other hand, let's assume that in order to produce bottles of water, you use relatively more workers and relatively less capital goods. That is to say, relatively less machineries. Let's assume that country A is relatively richer in capital goods and has a relatively scarcer endowment of laborers. That country will specialize in the production of computers. Let's assume that country B, on the other hand, is relatively richer in workers and has a relatively scarcer endowment of machineries. That country will specialize in the production of the goods that is characterized by a more labor-intensive production, that is to say, bottles of water. So fundamentally, specialization will be driven by the endowment of the factors of production that the two, three, many countries taking part of international trade have. So the key factor here driving specialization and trade is the relative endowment of factors of production. There are many other things that I would need to add in terms of specialization in the Escher-Rolling theorem not being complete, but perhaps we can leave this to a second stage. Just let me add, and then I shut up, one final thing. The Escher-Rolling and more in general, the marginalist approach to international trade rests heavily on the building blocks of marginalist theory that have been heavily criticized starting from the 50s or the 60s of the 20th century by proposers of the reappraisal of the surplus approach. So if you buy the critique to the marginalist approach, to the pillars of the marginalist approach, just take in mind that that critique applies also to the marginalist approach to international trade, which makes an extensive use of production function, substitutability between factors, and all the other ingredients of the marginalist theory that critical approaches to economics have, I would say, proved to be logically and analytically wrong. I'm leaving it here. Thank you for your patience and for your attention. I'm leaving the floor.
So for the audience online, Professor Pariboni was not sharing any slides. Instead, Professor Cesaratto will, and we are resuming soon.
Let's wait a few seconds, please. I will begin in a few seconds. Be patient. Well, let me say, first of all, thanks for the invitation again from this very interesting initiative. I'm particularly interested since one of my concerns when I was really the early years at the university, maybe even before, was on the capitalist economies. Perhaps because when I was young, we read Marx, so there was a lot. We learned a lot from Marx on the importance of studying the capitalist economies, and now I'm trying to study a little the relationship between the Dr. Riccardo and then Antonella Palumbo in one seminar called the Classical Circus Approach. And the curiosity was raised again about the realization that you archaeologists, antiquists in general, student of ancient economics, use a lot the concept of circus. So it was interesting to, take this opportunity of the fact that you use a lot the concept of circus to see the relation between your disciplines and the classical circus approach. Anyway, let me begin my talk of today. Riccardo Pariboni, non David, explained the basic tool used in referencing the international economics, which is the balance of payment. And Riccardo also explained two main approaches to the two main theories of international trade. That is the classical theory, so absolute specialization in absolute advantages in Adam Smith and relative advantages in David Riccardo, and the alternative theory is the marginalist theory, which is based in which international trade is motivated by the different endowment, different relative scarcity of production factors in the different economies. So very different approaches. One point I did not agree with Riccardo, that the interest for international trade was born from the early days of the Industrial Revolution. Indeed, what I'm talking about, the main subject of my talk is mercantilism, which is something about international trade that was born well before the Industrial Revolution. In the sense that mercantilism was the dominant school of economics. This was not an academic school of economics, where the mercantilists were merchants themselves, most of them. Some of them were philosophers like Locke or Hume and others. And mercantilism is a school that apparently was defeated in the late 18th century by Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations against mercantilism. But mercantilism has never disappeared. has never disappeared and reappeared in various forms. And mercantilist policies have never disappeared. We are living again today in a mercantilist era with tariffs, sanctions, and all these economic tools which belong to the mercantilist tradition. So mercantilism was the dominant school of economic thought in the late Renaissance, since the early modern period. It was called cameralism in Germany. In Italy, the greatest Italian mercantilism is the great Antonio Serra. From the name, small treatise on the wealth of nations and poverty of nations reminds of Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. Mercantilism is a national economic policy. You want to maximize the wealth of your nation, particularly the financial wealth of your nation. And so nowadays, mercantilism and economic nationalism are two overlapping terms in a sense. And they have, as I will say, a positive meaning and a negative meaning. I mean, you can have two kinds of mercantilism, of economic nationalism. One positive and the other more hostile, more perverse. How a country accumulates financial wealth? Well, Riccardo explained before that you may accumulate financial wealth by having a trade surplus. I mean, if you, the mercantilists reasoned in terms of gold. The gold was the, let's say, the international money. And if you have a trade surplus, you receive more gold from your exports, then you lose gold through your imports. So trade balance implies that you are accumulating gold. Gold for what? Well, one idea was that a country that accumulates gold has also a larger political power. You can finance wars, for instance. And how to obtain a trade balance? Well, mercantilists are famous for supporting tariffs. You tax imports in order that the price rise and the prices rise, and you import less, and you tend to buy domestic goods. Riccardo already mentioned Escher, Scandinavian, Swedish economist, the Escher-Ohlin theorem, which is the international trade theory of classical economics. Escher also wrote a very important and beautiful treaty in 1930 something on mercantilism. It was quoted by Marx, by Keynes. And it's not the case that Escher wrote this treaty in the 30s, because of that century, during the first big financial economic crisis of capitalist economies, and international trade suffered a lot in that period, and countries also adopted mercantilist measures like tariffs. Escher introduced the concept of fear of goods. Through export, the country gets rid of excess of production. So it's important to export to defend employment. Otherwise, this excess of production, if this excess of production is not sold, firms will produce less. So let's find a destination to this surplus in exports. And also, So you defend employment and also accumulate financial wealth. So it's interesting to note that contrary to marginalism, the problem of economic problem is abundance, not scarcity. Adam Smith, although he was an anti-mercantilist, also used the term vento for surplus. I mean, exports are important to get rid of excess production. Keynes was sympathetic with mercantilism, and he said mercantilists killed two birds with one stone. The trade surplus meant, in their view, lower domestic unemployment and meant also financial wealth for the country. That's all. No, there's something else in mercantilism. First of all, what Escher, again, the historian of mercantilism, called the tragedy of mercantilism, because the target of maximizing the trade balance surplus. I mean, if you want a trade balance surplus that export larger than imports, this implies that you have to keep internal consumption and therefore wages low. If you produce a certain output, you have a surplus that you can export only if you reduce internal consumption, and to reduce internal consumption, one good way is to keep wages low. And on the other side, low wages give you support your exports because low wages implies price competitiveness. You are able to sell your export at a lower price than competitors. So at the same time, low wages reduce internal consumption, so you are an exportable surplus, make you competitive because you can sell at lower prices, and above all, low wages means high profits. So you see that it's not so much, as Escher said, that through a trade surplus you get rid of an excess production. Because why do you have an excess production? Because you are keeping wages low. If the problem is the excess of production, well, why don't you increase wages and absorb the excess production through higher internal consumption? So, and you see that there is a linkage, but only one mercantilist really recognized this linkage between the classical surplus theory. Well, first of all, we should not mix up the classical surplus theory and the external surplus. The classical surplus theory is around this equation: P minus N equal S. P is the social product and the necessity given to workers. So the social product, as Antonella explained more detailed way, the social surplus is what remains social product after we have paid the necessities, wages to the working class. As the surplus, the social surplus remains is something that belongs to the capitalist, the elite anyway, and the elite do not consume all the social surplus. So in this situation, no doubt that net exports are a vent for surplus, are a way to find a market. Don't forget that the surplus is made of commodities. Commodities must be sold. So exports are a way to get rid of the part of the social surplus that capitalists do not consume themselves. But I mean, there is no excess. I mean, there is excess production. There is a social surplus because wages, the necessities are kept low, there won't be any excess production in this economy if you increase wages and internal absorption. And moreover, note that because why mercantilism has never died? Well, we have had examples of mercantilist countries many times in the, not only in the 30s during the financial crisis when countries competed also by introducing tariffs and mercantilist policies. But for instance, in the post-war period, countries like Japan and Germany have been very often accused of adopting an export-led and mercantilist policy. So, and mercantilist policies are, you know, might solve a problem for a country, especially for the capitalists of the country, as a way to get rid of the social surplus. But it's destabilizing for the international economy, the sense that if you have countries that pursue systematically pursue a export-led model, systematically pursue a surplus in the balance of payments, symmetrically, you have countries we are in balance of pay deficit. And as Riccardo explained before, if a country has a balance of payments deficit, it accumulates debt. And then you have the debt crisis. So mercantilist behavior can be, especially if adopted by important countries, is a destabilizing of the world economy. As I said, mercantilism overlaps with the concept of economic nationalism, and here the hero is a German economist, Friedrich List, which is Friedrich List, writing in the first half of the 19th century during the process of political and economic unification of Germany. He was a German nationalist. I mean, he was a supporter, of course, of the German unification. Nothing bad about that. List polemized with Adam Smith, saying, "You, Adam Smith, are, you know, supporting and preaching laissez-faire in international trade to developing countries." I mean, Germany was a developing countries compared to the United Kingdom at the time. But laissez-faire is precisely the policy, a policy that you support, because through laissez-faire policies, countries like Germany will never grow. And he supported, frankly, supported protectionist policies to sustain what Adam Smith, that recognized the validity of this argument in a sense, that industries that Adam Smith had named infant industries. And List has been incredibly influential, not only on Germany, but on many developing countries, especially after the Second World War. Countries like South Korea, Taiwan, etc. They read, they knew very well with List, they read List, followed List, not Adam Smith. Let me go to the conclusion. I think I talk too much. I have 5 minutes or something. Yeah. Personally, I know rather little about how trade developed in ancient times. I mean, I've done some readings of archaeologists and other scholars of ancient economies, but mainly concerned with the origin of inequality. I also know about the role of money in ancient economies, and well, we will have a lecture on money. I hope the good theory of money will be presented, and money also plays an important role. In international trade. I don't know if we have, because money is important to sustain demand for foreign goods. I don't know if in the ancient economies there are examples of fiat money, I mean fiduciary money, money without any gold backing it. For instance, the United States, now things will change with Trump, but so far have sustained the international trade by issuing dollars. I don't know whether in ancient times we have examples of empires playing this role. The papers I know are very interesting in this regard. The classical paper of Hopkins and Crawford are very, very interesting in looking at creation of money, of purchasing power to stimulate demand for foreign goods and international trade. And this is, I also wonder, these are just questions, whether the discovery of mines were behind the power and wealth of classical Athens or the Roman Empire. They discovered mines, conquered mines in Spain. These are really important aspects that, yeah, as economists, that we should be more interested in. And also, I'm very curious about what you would say, Professor Müller will say something about that, Polanyi's concept of port of trade. And so, my message is that to trade, you need an exportable surplus, as also Riccardo pointed out. The past, an exportable surplus may have depended on having natural resources, and later by having forms of manufacturing. The distribution of income is not secondary. The extraction of an agricultural surplus, for instance, allows an elite to trade a part of it in exchange for luxury goods produced elsewhere, or to create an army that needs metal for weapons, or to create a factory near the palace to produce exportable goods. With the growth of output and population, the volume of trade also grows. And perhaps also in ancient time, maybe some area was the driving force for other areas. Yeah, I think I stop here. My idea was to point out that this other tradition in economic theory, that the mercantilism and economic nationalism approach, that have negative sides, because mercantilist policies are based on keeping wages low and are destabilizing for the international economies. On the other side, forms of economic nationalism intended as the protection, especially of infant industries, as Friedrich List pointed out, but Smith recognized the validity of this argument, are a positive form of mercantilism, of economic nationalism. I mean, laissez-faire is not a good recipe for growth, and protectionism at the beginning of industrialization might be needed. Okay, thank you.